Now to talk more about this issue, it's getting a lot of attention all over the country, is Frank Morales. He's investigative journalist and author. Frank, thanks for being here. You contributed to the book Police State America, and in it you and others talk about how the civil disturbance strategies really are not what they seem here in the U.S. Can you explain that?
Yes, Operation Garden Plot, which is the overarching civil disturbance plan that the U.S. military enacts domestically, includes training in doctrine, so-called operations other than war, which is a euphemism for domestic war against the American citizenry. In its role, it's presumably to suppress dissent. So the designation of enemy combatants or non-combatant enemies and all these other kinds of euphemisms are simply grow out of training. So the former comment that was made a bit ago is somewhat disingenuous. This training has been going on for decades. We can go back to the 80s under Reagan with the Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act and a whole host of edicts and congressional and Pentagon edicts and directives which continually create a symbiosis between the military and the police function, which in a classical definition of a police state, that's what we have. We have the identification of the military and the police, and that is what defines a police state. So what we're seeing in places like Ferguson right now with 1033 transfer amendments which allow for a technology, weaponry to be transferred to local police departments, is the increasing identification of these two functions, the police function, the military function, which can only be undone through a recodification of the posse comitatus law, nationally and locally, which will criminalize the use of military forces, military assets, training and doctrine and weaponry on the domestic law enforcement level. Until the American people enact that, we're going to be seeing more and more Fergusons.
Sure. Let me jump in there for a minute, Frank, because a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, you're pointing out that you have to separate these two issues with the local police and the militarized police and using military here on U.S. soil. However, you're going to have two issues with that. Number one, you have the issue of terrorism, which many people will immediately defer to and say that we need to have military who can act in these types of situations in the case of a large-scale terror attack. And also they're going to go back to the war on drugs. And you mentioned Reagan, and you mentioned this going back to the 1980s, and really that's when a lot of this began, is it not? Back in the 1980s, started with the war on drugs, and hasn't most militarization of police forces grown out of that?
No. The creation of SWAT back in 1968 grew out of the protests that were happening around the country. The militarization of the police, and we ask the question not so much what is occurring with the militarization of the police, but why. We ask the why question. The why question is to enact a more or less a counterinsurgency war against dissent. The militarization of the police, yes, I mean, there are aspects to that overarch with some of these other issues you mentioned. But most importantly, it's about civil disorder suppression. It's about the suppression of so-called civil disturbance. And this is what we miss in this discussion. The question of why all this militarization has to do with the suppression of dissent. The war on terror is a war against dissent, period.
You said that this grew out of protests that were happening in the 80s. What protests are you talking about?
No, going back to the late 1960s with the creation of SWAT. The militarization of the police is not something that happened yet last week. It's been increasingly growing over the last 4 decades with increasing evisceration of the posse comitatus act, the posse comitatus law, which criminalizes the use of military assets within domestic law enforcement. Our democracy is founded upon a strict separation of these two functions, the entities of force, so to speak, the police and the military. The increasing symbiosis, if not identification, between these two functions is the classic definition of a police state. And this has been occurring for decades. The origin of these encroachments upon our civil liberties and the militarization of local law enforcement began as a consequence of civil disorder training, which grew out of the Kerner Commission, for example, 1968 federal commission, which was looking at civil disorders, so-called riots across the country that happened in over 109 cities in 1967. So the whole question of militarization of the police and so on is rooted in an understanding of what counterinsurgency against the American people is about. A preemptive war against the American people to suppress their ability to dissent, The wars abroad, this is the dialectic that we need to understand. The wars abroad require the suppression of protest and dissent at home.
And that's what you're talking about. And that's what you're talking about when you're talking about the 60s. Unfortunately, we're short on time, but fascinating history here of how this has all taken place. And we'd love to have you back to talk more about it. Author and investigative journalist Frank Morales, thanks so much for your time.
You're welcome.
We are anonymous. We are legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. Expect us.